Well, welcome. Special welcome to Peter Camp. I'm going to be talking about Nehemiah. The title's Building Biblical Leadership. That's a pun. Sorry in advance. In a world where Satan's in control, in order to be a Christian, we have to become leaders. Because he's in control, we're leading in a different path. We're headed in a different direction, and we're called to make disciples in that direction. We're called to leadership, and yet a lot of people don't spend time or effort thinking about what does it mean to be a leader, let alone what does it mean to become a Christian leader, and there are differences which we'll be looking at. So the first point is the purpose for leadership is not simply to be leaders and be in that position of whatever it is, but rather God wants all Christians to become godly leaders so that he may bring his people to a place of blessing. So that's the ultimate objective that we have as we're relating with others. We're trying to love them and serve them and bring them to a place of obedience and a place of blessing for God. So that's the end to which we're being motivated. So what's the support for this? There's lots. 2 Timothy, Ephesians 4, Ephesians 5, 1 Peter, they're all listed there, which are part of the Great Commission, part of the love one another, the being servants, being leaders. Some of the qualifications of godly people are that we be leaders. But hopefully the latter parts of the sermon will illustrate, funny noises coming from the right wing, how it is that we're supposed to become leaders. So this sermon was initially prepared as a series of workshops I was going to be leading for HYPE, which is the CUIT High School Youth Excited About Excellence, Pursuing Excellence. But we didn't have enough individuals, so I was kind of sitting on this mass of stuff I had researched and decided to turn it into a sermon. So it was going to be many segments. We were going to be going over sections of chapters at a time, but you guys are sharp, so we're going to try to cover in broad swatches, brushstrokes, the full 13 chapters of the book of Nehemiah, seeing not only what is leadership, but how does that play out in practice, and what then should we do because of that. So, second point is biblical leadership requires much more than influence. And the question here is, are you developing yourself? So if you ask a lot of people, how do you define leadership? What is leadership? Generally, those who've thought about it or read some business books will say leadership is influence, the ability to bring others to a goal. And that's a very sound definition of leadership. Without followers, it's hard to, be a leader. And without a goal or a vision, it's hard to be a leader. And without bringing people from point A to point B, you're just a byproduct. So leadership is influence, nor is it productivity, just getting all the stuff done yourself. It requires having followers. But under that definition, Hitler was a tremendous leader, frankly. He had a vision. He brought nations to execute on that vision. But there's something more than to leadership for Christians, what it means to be a Christian leader. So a Christian leader, as defined, this is my own definition, so feel free to add to it or comment on it, is biblical leadership is using the talents and opportunities God has given you to positively influence others to follow Jesus Christ, that would be salvation, and do God's will, that is sanctification. So we have to use the ways that God has created us and the opportunities or circumstances that he's built around us. I have to use them. It takes effort and work to help us positively influence, not just simply influence, but positively influence them to either come to a saving knowledge of Christ or a better knowledge of Christ, and then do what God has said for the ultimate purpose, referring to the above, of bringing God's people, others, to a place of blessing. Questions thus far? No. Well, that's great. So I have points A and B there, that it is predicated on knowing God and his way, so the ability to discern God's will. If we are simply leading our own vision, we're not being biblical leaders. We are using the talents and opportunities God has given us and subverting other people because we're taking them somewhere other than where God wants us. That's not biblical leadership. Seeking your own vision is not biblical leadership. and it requires other-centeredness and a high degree of self-awareness. Other-centeredness is pretty clear, but a biblical leader, unlike, say, Hitler, is one who's concerned about the needs of the followers. It's not, I want to be the one to get to a position of glory, but I want to be the one to help you come to a position of glory. So what are your needs? Where are you going? How can I help positively influence you? And the second half of that is requires a fair degree of self-awareness. Where am I in relation to you? Where am I in relation to God? So what reference I don't have on this sermon is Exodus 33:11, in which Moses and Joseph, yes. So the Lord spoke to Moses face to face as a man speaks to his friend. This is in the temple. And he would return to camp, that is Moses. But his servant Joshua, the son of Nun, a young man, did not depart from the tabernacle. So what's this? Joshua is taking heed to spend time in the presence of God, to know God better. If you look at the lives of Joshua versus Moses as leaders, you see Joshua had far less snafus as a leader. He was spending time knowing God's will and looking at himself. One of Moses' big faults was that he didn't pay heed to what God had told him to do. He struck the rock versus speaking to the rock. He didn't trust what God was saying, and Joshua didn't have that same problem, in part because he was spending time in the presence of God. And if you want to talk about spending time in the presence of God, there are numerous examples which hopefully we're going to be looking at. So, to recap what we've covered thus far as leadership as a definition, we see there's an end to it, which is to help other people get to a place of blessing. In order to be a leader, we both need to recognize what is that place of blessing and what's our role. Some people are called to greater degrees of leadership than others, some capacities, some not. The reference the last one in parentheses under point 1, the 1 Timothy 2:12, talks about the role of females in the church and the different manifestation of leadership that they have, and yet the same concept of bringing others to Christ, the discipleship process, that's still leadership that's available to all of us. So that it can look different, but we need to figure out what are those differences so that we are careful not to neglect any opportunities that we have. And that requires development. So, definition of leadership is using talents and opportunities to positively influence others. And with that, we come to the book of Nehemiah. So a little context of Nehemiah. I assume most of you are familiar with him. He's not a turtle, contrary to popular belief.
He isn't.
He's also a turtle? Oh, okay. Multiple people share the name. He is. He's not an amphibian. He was an individual. Close. It's one of those biblical characters. Nehemiah was, we see in the last verse of chapter 1, for I was the cupbearer of the king. He is in a significant leadership role, right next to the king, really personal role in the Persian Empire under King Artaxerxes. Some of the kings are problematic, and you look at Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, because the timeline of them chronologically was switched in the Bible. And the title of Xerxes means basically king guy. So you've got to pay attention to who they are. But this is as the children of Israel are returning from captivity. They've been in captivity for 70 plus years. They return in multiple waves. But none of that is really important. The one important thing that I wanted to mention was that previously the wall had been attempted to be rebuilt. And at that time, the surrounding nations, in Ezra, we'll get to it, said, "Hey, king, people are building this wall." And king was like, "Stop that." And this is now 77 years after that. So 77 years, the city of Jerusalem had been, God's holy city, had been basically entirely in rubble. There were still Jews living there, but it was greatly diminished. And yet that was the city where God said he would be blessing his people. That was the city where God's people were supposed to congregate, and yet they couldn't, because if they amassed there or started living there, people would just come and wipe them out. I looked up what happened 77 years ago. I thought it might be interesting for the theater folks. Wizard of Oz and Gone with the Wind were first produced. LaGuardia Airport opened, for those who travel a lot. Grapes of Wrath, for people who like the book, was published. And probably more importantly, it was the start of World War II and Superman debuted. So think about how long ago all those things appear in your mind. That is how long the people of Israel had been longing for the rebuilding of the wall, and yet had been incapable of doing so. They hadn't had those opportunities to exhibit the leadership. And this is where Nehemiah steps in and doesn't seek to build the wall simply for his own sake, or simply because he wants that spot in history as the guy who rebuilt the wall, but he rebuilds the wall for God's glory, to bring people to a position of glory, and so that God will remember him eternally, not temporally. So that's the first point under section 3, biblical examples of leadership in Nehemiah, and are we missing out on opportunities to lead? So we're going to break down some verses, again, briefly, of how is it exhibited there, and how can we exhibit leadership in our life. So first point, Nehemiah was motivated by a future reward, not a temporal one, to accomplish earthly tasks, building the wall. So 3 times Nehemiah, well, 5 times, says, remember me. It's the main motivating factor that's sourced in the book. The authorship is concerned that he's directly writing things down. And he says, remember me, my God, for the good according to that I have done for the people. So he's saying, I'm doing good for the people. I'm bringing them to a place of blessing. God, I don't want you to miss this. He says, remember me, O God, concerning this, and do not wipe away the good deeds that I have done for the house of God and for my forward service. This is when he's facing opposition, and he's saying, I'm getting charged with things that I'm not doing improperly, but remember me for the good stuff. And then, remember me, O God, concerning this also, and spare me to the greatness of your mercy. In 13:22, he returns after 12 years away and rights a lot of wrongs. And then his last verse is, remember me, O God, for good. And he's really concerned about God's reputation. He's really concerned about his reputation in the eyes of God. He's not concerned about the naysayers. But with the above verses, he is concerned about the people. The 2 references in parentheses are when he says, remember them, and he applies the same metric of not executing his own sense of vengeance or own sense of retribution against his opposition, Tobiah, and Sabbath, but he is trusting that God will remember them. So, in creating this outline, I went through the whole book, and started by just jotting down under each chapter the lessons of leadership one could learn. And there are many. As you all know who do inductive Bible study, when you start observations, they're more and more and they pile upon them. And later to the end of the book, you start getting observations like, this is a repeat observation, but it's just so good, can't ignore it. Even in the book of Nehemiah, where if you read, you'll notice I'm skipping chapter 11 because that's just a genealogy. Basically, it's a list of people. Some of the other chapters are largely lists of people, but in them, too, you have numerous lessons, and I had to squish to fit everything on the page and leave you space to make notes. So in chapter 1, verse 2, Nehemiah says that Hanan, one of my brethren, came with a man from Judah, area of Israel, and I asked him concerning the Jews who had escaped, who had survived the captivity, concerning Jerusalem. And they said to me, the survivors who are left in the captivity of the province are in great distress and reproach. The walls of Jerusalem are also broken down, and its gate with burned with fire. So it was, when I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned. For many days I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven. So one of the first examples of leadership, one of the key examples, is Nehemiah was seeking to be informed. He was not simply relying on his own perception of what was the state of Israel, what was the state of Judah and the people, but he was actively going out and asking. Somebody came and he wanted to know. So that key lesson is we're supposed to be seeking continual information, and numerous times Nehemiah seeks information. Later he goes And when he shows up, he secretly surveys the wall. And then when he's talking with leaders, he asks them questions. And then when he's facing opposition, he asks them questions. He's not demonstrating a pride of, I know what the case is, but rather he's demonstrating a willingness to accept information and be receptive to what God might be revealing to him through reality or through the input of others. So that is a key prospect that differs just leaders from biblical leaders. If you're not actively seeking additional information, you're not heeding the biblical commandments, as he said in Proverbs 27:22, to have a multitude of counselors that are giving us wisdom. Rather, we're seeking our own vision that might have first at one time been God's vision, but then God wants to be revealing something else, but we've shut him out. So if we find ourselves doggedly pursuing one track without testing and asking God, we might be missing out on opportunities to be a biblical leader. 4, he develops himself in advance. He's not only in a position of authority in the social structure as the king's cupbearer, but he's also planning in advance, and we'll get to that in just a moment. And in verse 11, where he's talking about his role, king's cupbearer, this was a really prestigious role. You basically got to eat all the stuff of the king, and yet Nehemiah considered it basically nothing. Just a tiny footnote. Oh, this is relevant. I was the king's I was the king's cupbearer, but he's not holding that role as the king's cupbearer, etc. He's willing to set that aside as necessary. So in chapter 2, verses 4, we see the next lesson. And then the king said to me, so Nehemiah shows up sad 12 months later. And the king's like, why are you sad? You've never been sad before. And the king said to me, why is it, what do you request? Nehemiah prays to the God of heaven and then lays before his request. And his request, he illustrates a number of shrewd biblical leadership principles. He gradually says, the city of my fathers, the tombs, they're destroyed. I'd like to go repair them. I'd like to repair the tombs in the city. Basically, it's Jerusalem. So he's not doing an all or nothing bid, but as the king is responding, he's responding as well. So an application to us nowadays is I don't think any of us are in the construction business or rebuilding walls, but we all do have to positively persuade others. So as we positively persuade others, are we laying it on heavy and thick, take it or leave it? Or are we recognizing where they're coming from and helping them shrewdly along to see, oh yes, this is a good goal. Father's tombs, respect for one's ancestors, that's something the king approved of. As a king whose ancestors were kind of important people. The whole return to the city, there's dynamics of gradual work within somebody who might otherwise be opposed to the idea. Remember, previously the wall was trying to be built, and previous kings said, stop it. So Nehemiah is recognizing this. He's exhibiting an awareness of the circumstance to appropriately bring something in. It's not to be said that sometimes we don't have to directly address something, but again, biblical leadership is finding a balance between a lot of these principles. So when the city, the place of my father's tombs, lie in waste, and then the king says, yeah, that sounds good. How long will your journey be, and when will you be returned? So it pleased the king to send me, and I set him a time. So Nehemiah has, in the time that he'd first become aware of the problem, to now, he's been planning. He's been thinking about what it would take to undergo this task that God has set before him. He's not just getting overwhelmed with, oh no, they're walls, I've got to build them, nor is he planning every little detail, as we'll see in just a moment. He has a sense of what is going to be required, and he's been using this time proactively while he's been waiting. So a lesson here is that he's timing things right. He's waiting for that opportune time. The first time you meet somebody might not be the best time to share the gospel. It can be, but it might not be, until they understand your motivation is not to snook them into some other weird worldview, but rather to help them get to a place that will help them be happy. So there's a balance here, and Nehemiah exhibits it. He also asks not only setting a time, but let letters be given to me. He knows I'm going to face opposition, in building this wall, King, you've given me the approval to do the task, but I'm also not going to shirk, now that I've asked to build the wall, on asking the other things I need to ask. Basically the permission, the stamp and seals of approval to say I can travel, I can get this wood to build the gates, I have the material I need to do this task. So a minor leadership point. There are many that I couldn't include in this list. The page is only so big and now I shrunk the margins. Is that he has awareness of the needs and is pushing through when he recognizes God's favor is upon him. Point C, he works within the existing authority structure. Again, he's referencing these letters, and he's not saying, hey King, I've written up these letters. I want you to sign them that grant me the approval. He's deferring to the king in the structure and not appearing too overeager. There's nothing suspicious about the letters. He's like, let letters be written. The king's not going to write the letters. Nehemiah's not going to, might write the letters. But he's not over-controlling the situation. He's functioning within the order that's already there. He's playing a very deferential role throughout the entirety of chapter 1 when he's relating to the king, in chapter 2. He exhibits a respect for the authority. So even though Nehemiah is championing God's goal, he's still not shunning the role of leadership that God has placed secularly over him. So there's a balance there. Interesting to note, as I said, Ezra, there was approval for building the temple, but then it was turned around when faced opposition. Ezra shunned the request of sending horsemen to go with him because he had said to the king, I don't need horses, because if I needed horses, I wouldn't be trusting in God. And yet here Nehemiah is like, oh, if you're going to send horsemen with me and captains, I'll take them. Recognizing again that what might have been God's will in one sense, when God was speaking to Ezra, might not be God's will in another sense. What's right for one individual, not accept the horseman because it might show him as relying upon man's strength versus God's protection, is a total moot point in Nehemiah's case, where he's like, yeah, horsemen, that'll be good. That's nice. I'll have people with me to help balance out the opposition I'm likely to face. So it requires, again, a balance. And as a reader, if we've just read Ezra, we can recognize, oh, there's a difference between these two. I'm not imputing judgment. Both of these men of God were doing what God had said, yet they're exact opposites of each other. There's a subjectivity that the individual, Nehemiah and Ezra, knew about God's will, thus fitting into the larger authority structure of God's the one in control, not those around us who might be judging what we're doing. So moving on to 10, Sanballat and Tobiah, leaders of Adites and Nidites, Amorites and Heronites, basically are deeply disturbed that a man had come to seek the well-being of the children of Israel. So Nehemiah had shown up, and they knew why he'd shown up. He hadn't shown up just for his own good, but he'd shown up for the good of the people. And that was visible. So as we're leaders, generally people's eyes are on us, and we have to be careful of what we're doing and how we're acting, and yet we want to have that, what they're seeing not be for our own good, but as lamps that are pointing to the light of Christ. We want them to be seeing others through our own example. And then finally, under chapter 2, point E, Nehemiah has a clear and actionable goal. He says to the leaders of the children of Israel who are there in the city, come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem, that we might no longer be in reproach. No longer be in reproach if your walls were torn down and this was where your God had said, this is my people. There's a kind of a degree of, well, how come God hasn't provided for you? Again, recognizing Nehemiah is working to God's glory, working to the well-being of the people. His own role is more of a conduit. And that also has a very clear goal. We're not trying to rebuild the nation, nor we're trying to rebuild the walls, the temple, the whole city, nor the economy, nor the army. No, he's got a clear goal. First, the walls. So a leader takes a dynamic of breaking things down. Napoleon, you all know he was famous for sitting and just thinking through all the opportunities, all the outcomes, what needed to be done in what order, and was a great military leader in that capacity. But again, as a Christian leader, we need to be making sure we've identified what is God's will for me here and now. Rebuilding the temple would be a great thing, but maybe that would be better for Ezra. Maybe that would be better for another person. You know, that King David wanted to build the temple. It was like, no, just wait up a bit. So again, clear and actionable goals that help the others do stuff with what he's been said. He's broken down into chunks.
Can I ask a question, Chad?
Please.
Just about the visibly seeking the betterment of people. I feel like in a lot of circumstances there can be times when a leader is actually doing something that is for the betterment of God's people, but people won't necessarily see it that way. For example, like Moses trying to take the Israelites across a gigantic river. They are not seeing that as this is good for us, but yet it still was for their betterment. So how does that play out? Because it's not always visible to everyone who is being led.
Yes, very good question. So what do you do when you're in a leadership position and people see what you're calling them to as being something that doesn't look like their betterment? Again, the walls are rubble. They know that they're going to face opposition. They've faced it before. The waters look deep and swift. That's where the influence comes in. That's where you have to be deeply aware of what are their needs, what are their fears, what are their concerns of the followers, of the people around me, and why are they resistant to what God is calling me to or God is calling them to. I think also Nehemiah kind of addresses this in verse 18, which is immediately after the call to rebuild the walls, that we might not be in reproach, see the distress we were in, how Jerusalem lies in waste, its gates are burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, that we may no longer be in reproach. And then I told them of the hand of my God, which had been good upon me, again elevating him to the position of cupbearer, and also the king's words that he had spoken to me. And they said, let us rise up and build. So they set their hands to this good work. So he didn't just set a goal, but he also told them necessary information around the goal that helped encourage them. So he said, God put me in this position. I'm coming as an outsider. He wasn't living here. We don't know if Nehemiah had ever been to Jerusalem. We suspect he hadn't. At least scholarship suggests. And he's saying, this is God's will. God told me this, so God's hand is with us. And you see in the early part of the book that the children of Israel are very receptive to what God has said. So Nehemiah is not saying, this is my own vision, but he's saying this is the vision of God. And the people respond appropriately. Sometimes that requires stepping out into the water with the ark, and then the water parting ways. Other times, you just raise a staff and the water seas just move. In our life, that's a balance, but that's where the influence plays in. We're not crossing rivers or crossing oceans or rebuilding walls, but God can still show himself strong on our behalf, particularly when we illustrate the motivation and the power that we have as Christians to accomplish this task. Again, it's not our task, it's God's task. And if it's God's task, then we have God's power to accomplish the task. And reminding people of that is really helpful. So there are a number of lessons in chapter 2. In fact, I would highly encourage you to, if you have a time, read through chapters 1 and 2 and just think about the ways that Nehemiah is dealing with authorities above him, deferring to the king and yet not shying away or balking when given an opportunity, and the way that he relates to people who are under his umbrella of authority, as he's appointed as basically governor at this time. And yet he's not dealing with them as a this is me, but rather we are God's, let's do this together. Not dwelling in the role, but dwelling in the goal. Again, I made up 15 pages of notes, of bullets, of all the lessons that you could pull out of this, and like the first 3 or 4 are just on chapters 1 and 2. And I can share that later. They might need explanation. Moving on to chapter 3. In verse 5, we see that, moving on to chapter 3, Nehemiah is keeping track of the efforts under him. There's a whole lot of chapter 3s, and so built the section of the wall between such and such and such and such a point. And so and their kin built such and such a section of wall in front of such. And if you have a map of Jerusalem, it's helpful, but still there are parts that's like, where exactly are they building this wall? And it's not archaeologically fully known. although they have sections where like they've just filled in rubble. It's like, okay, this is Nehemiah's wall, and then there are other sections of like tightly knit stone, and like, well, this came later, but they might have cleared away the rubble. But one of the main points here is Nehemiah is keeping track of effort. He's not simply setting a goal, motivating people to do the goal, and saying, okay, when I get new insight as to the goal, I'm going to tell new people. He's not just a spokesperson. He's actively engaged in management. He's actively engaged in the seeking the well-being of the people. And how do you seek the well-being of the people but know what they've been doing? Not, I have an assumption that so-and-so is building a section of the wall, but this is what was being built. It's factual. And he also knows who's not building. Next to them, the Technites made repairs, verse 5, but their nobles did not put their shoulder to the works of the Lord. And later, in verse later, the Technites build another section of the wall. So there's a little bit of value, verse 27. After them, the Technites repaired another section next to the great projecting tower and as far as the wall of Ophel. So he's keeping track of both people who aren't engaging in effort, along with this vision that God has said, and the people who are not only building, but building additionally as their needs supply. And we'll get to developing leaders briefly. In verse 28, that makes us immediately preceding the other reference to the Tekites, Nehemiah is giving personal ownership over the tasks. He's defining this is where you need to build, and the section you need to build was in front of your own houses, or in front of your own work. So he's getting them additional buy-in, because if the part of the wall they build is a bit shoddy, when people come attack the walls, which is what they did, they're going to be the first ones overrun. And there's a degree of, this is the wall that I built. Look how nicely put together it is. You can't avoid the shoddy workmanship if it's right in front of your house if you don't build it so nice and well. So he's adding additional degrees of motivation to his people. Chapter 4, Nehemiah faces a lot of opposition. The surrounding nations did not like the fact that the children of Israel are coming together and building a wall, and they numerous times send him letters, at least 4 times, saying, hey, come to this valley, we want to talk. And he's like, no. But he doesn't just say no, he says, why should I come? I've got this mighty work. What reason? Again, he's asking questions, putting the burden of proof on them. Another leadership tactic when facing opposition is help them to articulate why they're opposing you. He also plans for contingencies. He sets watches. He arms half of the people and has them working with both axe and sword. The sword wasn't working. And he's aware, he's again thinking through like Napoleon would, what might happen and preparing in advance to it. He's not simply reactionary, he's proactive. He also is actively growing his followers. Not easy work to wield a sword and a pickaxe, and yet Nehemiah is demonstrating, he's calling people up higher, and they're coming. He's seeking their eternal state and their benefit, not just settling himself with their current existence. Again, there's so many of these. 5:7, he confronts sin in the lives of the nobles. Basically, the people had been sold into slavery when they were trying to provide for themselves, and Nehemiah calls them out and says, why are you doing this? And they're like, yeah, you're right, we're wrong. And Nehemiah fixes it. Again, the direct approach, but it's really insightful to look at how he goes about doing it. Again, asking people versus just straight up condemning them. He does at points say, this is wrong, do you have an answer? He doesn't force change. 10 was a really interesting observation. Nehemiah doesn't write a law that says all of these slaves are released. He doesn't force them to tithe and go in and garnish their bank accounts. He says this is what you should be doing, and he lets the Spirit of God be convicting in them. So as roles of leaders, we're not dictators. Dictators bad, Hitler bad. We're biblical leaders, leaders who are helping incentivize people to follow God's will, and yet not overbearing so. So if you find yourself in an overbearing role, you probably want to be very careful in searching your motives to make sure that you haven't taken on more of a burden or task than God really is setting before you. And this also gives the opportunity for the people to earn glory by correcting. If I force somebody, a toddler, to give up an apple by taking it out of their hand, they didn't have the opportunity to demonstrate generosity or obedience because I forced them. So we're actually doing a disservice if we force people to do something. And, again, to the above, we might not know what is in fact best for them, similar to taking the horsemen or not. I think I just mentioned is actively grows followers, right? Confronts sins, makes plans for restitution. Not only does he confront this issue, but Nehemiah also says, here's what I want you to do. Not just, it's up to you to repay. He says, this is what I want you to repay. It's essentially renegotiating the terms of a loan. He says, this is what's reasonable. You were sold, like people were sold, there's an economic deal here, but it was wrong. So not nixing the entire thing, but adapting it. And he adds an incentive. I didn't just say this. I'm not just saying it's wrong. If you say it was wrong and you repent, why don't you also enter into essentially an oath to say you're not going to do it again? He adds the degree of incentive so that they don't get caught up in this folly again.
Can you
Yes.
let us know what the narrative is going behind chapter 5?
So chapter 5, the narrative of...
Nehemiah, just like what was the conflict that resulted in these actions?
So the conflict was that the nobles who had remained in Judah, or had come back to Judah, had, in the time of captivity and oppression, taken advantage of their fellow people who weren't in such positions. So they'd exerted more taxes, they basically had bondservants, but then they didn't release them. So terms of bondservants under the Jewish law was that you release them after 7+ years, or depending on the term of their bondage. So they're not doing this. And Nehemiah is responding to the plea of the people. They're saying, hey, Nehemiah, you're doing good, but we're being opposed not by our external enemies, but our own people. And Nehemiah's like, this is wrong. And that's when he confronts the leaders. Does that answer your question? Chapter 6, Nehemiah faces severe opposition from the opposing people. They see the wall coming up even faster, and they start getting really fearful. And they decide, if we couldn't get him to come down, we're going to cut off his power supply and go directly to the Persian king, not recognizing that Nehemiah was drawing power from God. And they said, hey, Nehemiah, if you don't stop and come talk with us, we're going to tell the king that you're setting yourself up as a ruler and a king, and you're building armies, and you're trying to, go beyond the scope of permissibility that the king had originally granted you. And this is when Nehemiah is like, remember them. This is 6:14, the reference. And he says, no, that's not the case. You're making this all up. So Nehemiah has carefully examined his own motives, and he's continuing examining them. Is this indeed what I'm doing? Sometimes the biggest insight we can have into our behavior is from detractors. When somebody who doesn't like what you're doing says, no, I don't like what you're doing because you're doing it for X. It's like, am I? No, I'm not. Or, oh, you're right, there is a seed of X. I should remove this splinter in my own eye. Splinter in my own eye so I can appropriately address whatever issue you have. But Nehemiah has done this introspection. He knows his motive. His motive is obedience to God, and the desire is not his own exaltation to be king of the people, but his desire is for the good of the people of Israel and out of obedience of God. And his glory is yet future. His remember me is not described as temporally, it's described as eternally. So he's not used by false accusations, but he and all of us should use them to prompt introspection or reflection. And correspondingly, in verse 11, he tests out personal motivation. And in verse 16, finally, 52 days after starting, the wall is completed. 52 days after starting, wall around Jerusalem done. And all the enemies and all the nations were like, whoa, boy. And they were disheartened because they perceived that this work was done by Nehemiah. No. They perceived that this work was done by God. They saw it as being God's work. Nehemiah, through all of this, is pointing to God. One of the other components to factor in here is we live in a world of instant texting and all sorts of ease of communication. They didn't. So it took time for traveling and news to pass. So when all the enemy is here, it's like, we just heard that he came here, and now the next message we hear is that they're done. It's like, well, we missed our opportunity to attack. We missed our opportunity to do stuff. And because Nehemiah had armed the workers on the wall, they the enemies didn't attack. So they'd wanted to, those who were immediately nearby. So again, Nehemiah is working for God's good. He's not putting himself in a position of praise or authority or a mantle of figurehead, but he's, if at all a figurehead, his figurehead is pointing up to God. And likewise, when we find ourselves in positions of leadership, however that manifests itself, if people thank us for taking out the trash all the time, I don't know, whatever other forms of servant leadership we might embody, it's not us who should be receiving that praise, but it should be directed to the God that's helped transform our hearts and our lives so that we're faithful stewards in obedience to Him. There's a degree of accepting, recognition, but not to the degree that we're stealing recognition from God. And Nehemiah does not put himself in that role of usurping the recognition that the nations, opposing nations, gave to God. Consider that, opposing nations gave the glory to God. So, by the way, the wall was completed, the gate wasn't hung, but in chapter 7, Nehemiah learns to delegate. He includes other individuals, and he gives charge of Jerusalem to his brother Hanai. So he was responsible for helping build the wall, but then recognizes my skills and talents might be better served by God in another capacity. I'm not going to keep holding on to titles and roles. I recently read the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, and he says towards the end of it, I made a policy to never turn down a public office and never step down. And correspondingly, by the end of his life, he concurrently held 8 leadership roles, postmaster, etc., ambassador, statesman, governor, and just if people want to elect somebody else, they're willing to, but I won't step down. But sometimes we as biblical leaders who don't have pride issues should be more than willing to recognize it was my role to bring somebody to one point, and then it's somebody else's role to bring somebody farther. I've endowed all this effort in something, and yet I'm willing to let it go because that is not where my worth and value is tied up, and I can freely encourage somebody else to take over for me. Correspondingly, then freeing yourself up to go where else God might be calling you, and He might be bringing you in a circumnavigous route back to that same individual or the same issue, but from a point where you don't have to worry about your pride because you've already put that up on a metaphorical altar. He's correspondingly then willing to take on outside tasks. Once he finishes the wall, God lays it upon his heart to take up genealogy and figure out who are all these people now that we've enclosed within a wall, which doesn't look like eating food, which was his former role, nor does it look like building walls. This looks like a lot of paperwork, and yet Nehemiah takes it on. So biblical leaders are willing to be called wherever God would have them, no matter the challenges, and doesn't shirk responsibility, recognizing that God can grow them into that capacity. And yet there's also an awareness, again, remember our definition, that biblical leadership is using the talents and opportunities God has given you. The talents and opportunities. Recognizing if I'm not the best person at paperwork, maybe I should refer to the first lesson we see in chapter 7, which is delegation, and finding somebody else to maybe fill that role. Again, there's a balance with all these principles and perspectives. It looks like I was vastly overambitious in the amount of material I would be able to cover. But we've covered a significant amount. I'd love to open it up to questions, and maybe I'll flesh out some of the remainder lessons at some other time. So, any questions from you guys? In summary, we are all supposed to be embodying leadership roles because that is how we go about doing the tasks that God has put before us. The verses that I didn't read at the top of your sheet are the Great Commissions and other verses that require us to be leaders, to go counter to this world. How else are we going to be committing these teachings to faithful people? How else are we going to be walking worthy? These are obligations we have that require this understanding of biblical leadership, calling others alongside as well. So questions? Chester?
So it seems like there's times when Nehemiah trusts God and just doesn't take any actions, instead just waits, and other times he's being really proactive. obviously that's a balance in all of our lives. How does Nehemiah work with that balance?
Really good question. I think that is answered in part by the point B of point 2 of the other-centeredness and high degree of self-awareness. He's in line with God's will, and he's seeking that. But there is that question of, when do we move forward? Gideon was a leader. Gideon was a leader who erred on the side of caution. He'd lay out fleeces and wet, dry, wet, dry. And God was like, just do what I want you to do. But at other times, Gideon says, no, you guys go home. God wants this opportunity for glory, and if there's so many of us who are so willing to attack, it might look like that was caught up in our own arms and our own strength versus God's strength. So even somebody like Gideon, who you might say is trepidatious, is sensitive to the Spirit of God and is discerning and open to God's prompting. So what's that obligation for us? Being very, very careful, particularly when we're in roles of authority in addition to roles of leadership. And the two are different. One is more title, the other is more action. One's more official, and the other is, again, the service that's not always recognized as it can be totally, at the bottom rung of whatever authority structure that you're doing what's good. Being very careful, whichever the case, to be receptive to God, to not have our own perspective of what leadership looks like, own perspective of the circumstances prevail, but rather God's perspective, which is why a quiet time is vitally important, to spend that time in Word, not just reading, but receiving, to be reflecting upon it, and to be convicted of where you might be erring. So, there's no easy answer, it's a balance.
You say all Christians should aspire to be leaders.
Yes.
So that could mean that you have a group of, say, here, everybody's a leader. So nobody's following, or everybody's leading, or is it?
Really good question. I was wondering if someone would pick up on that. Leadership also requires following, at times. Nehemiah, in chapter 2, is a follower of the role of the leader of the king. It's like, king, he doesn't say, I want to go to Jerusalem. He doesn't say, send me, but will you please send me? So he's recognizing his role there as a follower. And again, with the variety of roles, the variety of tasks we have, to one, maybe to build a wall, to somebody else, maybe a temple, to somebody else, serving on that wall, being a leader in how they're going about doing their service, so that other people are seeing and reminded that this is more than just scooping up piles of rubble and dumping them into the wall. This is an act of service, an act of leadership. This is helping, this is work for God. It looks like stonemanship, but it's work for God. So even in that role, the person who has no mantle, who might not even have a chance to speak to others, through their actions have the capacity to be leading others in having a proper perspective of their work. So that individual, the stonemason, is still following Nehemiah, but he's also in a role where, based upon his talents and opportunities, can be leading those around him. Theoretically, you can just continue to extend that analogy of you can, I guess, as long as you have people around you, you can be a leader and a follower at the same time. More questions?
Do you think that it's a bigger issue in Christianity that too many people want to be leaders, or not enough people are willing to step up?
Great question. It depends, I think, on the circumstances and structure, particularly structures which prioritize and emphasize and improperly give a degree of self-worth to the role of leadership. You see a lot of people desiring to be in leadership. In other environments where people haven't been told to be a leader, haven't had it broken down of what's it look like to be a leader, what's it look like to be a servant to the needs of others, which also fits under the definition of leadership. When people haven't been given that model, probably tend to shy away. I think also the more examples we have of biblical leadership, the easier it is for us to see how that might manifest itself in our life. I just recently finished reading the biography of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who, German pastor, was killed in a plot to assassinate Hitler, or because of his part of plot to assassinate Hitler. He was leading the church as a servant and helped change people's minds of what did it look like to be a leader in that environment. And therefore, other people followed after him. He was pioneering that way. Likewise, in society that don't have pioneers like him, you probably see it erring on the side of people don't step up to the mantle because they see all the problems that come with leadership. We didn't get to leadership is tough. It takes effort. We talked about effort in discerning one's own motives, discerning the will of God. Like, that's a hard thing to say, why am I doing this? Particularly when doing this comes with other trappings. So, we don't know how Nehemiah came to be cupbearer, but you have to ask, you have to assume that he was asking himself, because he asks frequently throughout the rest of the book, is this where God wants me to be? Am I going to accept that promotion to cupbearer? Or am I interested in that promotion to cupbearer not because the influence it might give me to positively help the people of God, but because it's a nice job? Right? Finding that balance is important, and it can weigh on one. And yet Nehemiah references in verse 2 when he's talking to the king, he reminds the king, don't forget my faithfulness and my stewardship. Like, I've been a good follower, so you can trust me with all this authority. So even in all of that, Nehemiah is exhibiting reliance on God and not, the weight of responsibility. Because if God wants to tell him to do something different, God can't, because he's readily asking. Does that answer the question?
Is there any time that Nehemiah actually verbally gives God the glory for a particular act, or is it just kind of inherent with his actions? In the sense it's sort of like, oh, Nehemiah, you're so cool, and he's like, oh, nah, it's all God,
Chapter 9, I'd highly recommend. It's a prayer, basically the whole thing. There's a little bit beforehand, in which Nehemiah says, God, I believe it should be chapter 9. You took us out of Israel, you did all these things, we rebelled against you, we broke your commandments, but in your great mercy, you protected us. The whole thing from verse 5 to end, Nehemiah is just praising God. Oh, sorry, this is Ezra. Right, I forgot who's actually giving the prayer. The book has the praise being given to God. I didn't look to see where Nehemiah directly said praise, but I think it's very apparent through the rest of his action. It might be in there. I'll have to look through it again. Yes, Fiona?
So, as you said, being a leader is it's not easy.
Yes.
So, it seems like one has to reach a certain maturity because you have to be in constant communication with God, right? Because you make sure you do God's will. So, but at the beginning you said that all Christians we should be leaders. So, for less mature, do you think about it at all, or you kind of reach a certain maturity and then, maybe now I'm right?
Great question. So doesn't leadership require a certain degree of maturity? So isn't then a time when you might not be mature enough to lead? Yes, maybe. At the same time, there are numerous ways that we can be leading others. I'd also say, so not exempting the fact that it might not be for somebody at some time, but also recognizing the goal of leadership ought to be there. Are we developing ourselves is the question. I might not yet be a leader, but I'm putting in that time and effort. Nehemiah didn't wake up and be like, oh, Hammond, what's going on in Israel? And then, okay, I'm going to go there, and I've got all these skills. No, he was developing all the way up to that point where he knew to ask, and he continued to develop, and then continued to develop, and continued to develop, and continues to develop, and we too have that same obligation to be developing, maybe not recognizing that opportunity. As cupbearer, he was basically stuck in court, eating and drinking the king's food. So it's like, well, what's the opportunities for leadership there? It might not be inherently present, and yet we have an obligation to be developing ourselves in anticipation of those opportunities, even if they might not arise. Or even if we feel like our talents and opportunities as a leader, as a servant, are not being fully utilized, we still should be developing ourselves, because we don't know how God might then use us once we get to that degree of maturity.
Well, I think you touched on it when you talked about the difference between leadership and authority, right? Because you can be an authority without any leadership skills,
Sadly.
or be a leader without any authority.
Yeah.
The maturity probably comes in, like, in order to be a leader, as you've defined it, being other-centered is something that's hard, and it's not always easy to just, if you were a not other-centered person, getting to that point is really hard. You have to put aside yourself and what you want, your desires, and learn to, like, see it in other people. So it's probably a process where you're always learning further how to see other people's needs, learn how to meet them, learn how to, like, ask God to help you with that whole process. It probably goes hand in hand with, like, humility and dependence.
Absolutely.
It's not going to be like right off the bat, you're all of a sudden like, I can be everyone's needs automatically.
And as we grow and develop as a leader in our willingness to respond to the opportunities and talents God's given us and that we've developed, God gives us more opportunities, and we have more talents. So more situations in which we can demonstrate leadership. He's able to then say, my servant Nehemiah is the one I want to use to fill this role. You have a question?
I think there's like two schools of thought when it comes to leadership. Is whether there's a threshold where you reach of becoming a leadership status, which is one I think is kind of something that we kind of talked about. And that's commonly believe that like, I'm not a leader yet. I got to make sure I reach this threshold, cross it, and then I become a leader. As opposed to like an expanding scope where you can have like, a particular leadership position where you're given something to like attack or something to take and expand from there. And God will lead you in that path. You see yourself expanding as a leader as the scope grows. I think that might help.
That's a great analysis. The threshold perspective is similar to the question you were asking, but the problem it causes is people who have the capacity to be a leader hold back because they say, oh, I'm not a leader. And they miss. If we constantly wait until we're ready to be a leader to lead, we will never be ready to be a leader. Because we haven't led. It's better to try and do something and have God redirect that momentum and redirect that effort than for us to sit on our hands or twiddling our thumbs, because who's winning in that dynamic? Not God, not you. There's only one other individual. I think that's the time we have, so we can talk about them later. I'm sorry. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you that you've sent your Son, the captain and overseer of our faith. Thank you that through his leadership and service, and calling the disciples and calling us, we have ready access to you, that we can love you and do the work that you've set before us with a whole heart. And thank you for the provisions you provide for us when we step out in faith, responding to your will, for the needs of others, and for the way that you glorify us when we follow what you set before us. Thank you for the examples in your word. We pray that you help us to apply them to our lives, to meet the needs of those around us for your glory. We pray that you bless the rest of our afternoon. Thank you for this food. All these things we pray in your name. Amen.